Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. We are so excited to share the power of healing from complex trauma with all of you. It's inspiring to know that so many of you tune in to learn about the personal and collective healing that can come from resolving complex trauma. We are thrilled to offer the Inner Circle, NARM's online learning community. Each month, members receive direct mentorship from NARM creator Dr. Lawrence Heller, NARM training director Brad Kammer, and other NARM faculty through live webinars. These webinars deconstruct the various elements of complex trauma, including issues related to developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. They will also guide you through a step-by-step process of learning how to integrate NARM into your work by sharing NARM demonstration videos of client sessions and then pulling up the hood to describe how NARM is being used with real clients to resolve complex trauma. The NARM Inner Circle is a great place to start your exploration of NARM. Whether you're a mental health or other helping professional, educator, or just interested in addressing complex trauma, there's a place for you within the Inner Circle community. You, our Transforming Trauma listeners, can receive $100 off your annual membership when using the code TransformingTrauma15 at checkout. Visit narmtraining.com/innercircle to sign up and for more information. I'm delighted to welcome our guest for today's episode, Daniel Shaw. Daniel is a licensed clinical social worker and psychoanalyst with a private practice in both New York City and Nyack, New York. He also serves on faculty and as supervisor at the National Institute for the Psychotherapies. He's provided professional counseling for cultic group former members, their friends, and loved ones since 1994. Daniel previously joined Transforming Trauma on episode 28, where he discussed his first book, Traumatic Narcissism, Relational Systems of Subjugation. His most recent book, Traumatic Narcissism and Recovery, Leaving the Prison of Shame and Fear, was published in 2021. Dan was awarded the Margaret Taylor Singer Award for advancing the understanding of coercive persuasion and undue influence. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Daniel Shaw. Daniel, welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's so good to have you back with us. And if it feels right to you, I'd like to just start off by asking you right off the bat what you would want for listeners to understand or to gain from our conversation today.
Great question. Well, let's get deep fast. Okay.
Yes.
I do think that in this book, I've tried to include more that I have learned from my patients and from other teachers since I wrote the first book. And probably the thing that I've learned that I find most valuable is to understand the ways in which we become alienated from ourselves because of trauma. And to understand the meaning of that, in other words, that there becomes an internal antagonism between a part of us that wants to live and a part of us that is afraid to live and wants to shut down life. And that this takes many forms, but is almost always present. Well, I think is always present in people who have suffered certainly complex trauma and developmental trauma, relational trauma. And it's that discovery of the internal antagonism within the person that my work now tends to focus more on. And as we discover that situation, the work becomes about how to heal that breach, how to bring together internally the parts of self that have become alienated so that there can be a sense of earned, secure attachment from within. Since in most traumatic situations, secure attachment has not been possible because of the environment. How can it be found from within? And that's really what I try to focus on in this new book. What's it called, my book? Oh, yeah, Traumatic Narcissism and Recovery, Leaving the Prison of Shame and Fear.
That sounds great. I would love to explore that with you. The last time you were here, you and Sarah talked about your first book, Traumatic Narcissism, Relational Systems of Subjugation. And so I'm assuming that in the time since you last met, you are finishing up this last book. And I wonder if there was
Right.
anything else you've been up to.
Well, no, mainly my practice, which has been busy during COVID. I think many of us have discovered a lot of people have been reaching out for therapy. And so my practice is a bit more busy. And I supervise a number of clinicians who are in training at the National Institute for the Psychotherapies in New York. So that keeps me pretty busy. And I'll be teaching there as well in New York. I teach in the 4-year curriculum for psychoanalytic candidates. I teach second-year students about transference and countertransference. So all of that is keeping me busy enough.
Love it. I love it. So to dive back into your second book, will you tell us more what compelled you to write Traumatic Narcissism and Recovery?
Yeah, I'm going to credit Janina Fisher, the teacher that is so well known and so popular. Her book, Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors, subtitled Overcoming Internal Self-Alienation. I read this book after having been trained for a year by her in her sensorimotor psychotherapy training. So there was like a weekend, I don't know, like about 8 or 10 weekends throughout the year. And she was present for most of those. I was really taken out of my comfort zone because I had been trained in a relational psychoanalytic modality, which is not orthodox by any means, and which I think is trauma sensitive. And I had mentors who I think were very trauma sensitive, Lou Aaron and Philip Bromberg in psychoanalytic training. But Janina Fisher brought something new in to me that I hadn't been exposed to. And her understanding of neuroscience, her understanding of parts, her understanding of self alienation had a profound effect on me. I taught a group of students. We used her book for a study group last year. And it was probably the third time I read the book, and it had such a powerful impact. So that has changed for me since I wrote my first book, although I was just beginning to dip into the idea of the multiplicity of the self. I was delving into that more fully in the first book. In this book, I take it a step further. I've been very influenced by Janina Fisher's work, but in my own studies of her work and the influences that she bases her work on, I've studied internal family systems, dialectical behavior therapy, EMDR. I've studied structural dissociation theory. So these are all now playing a greater role in the way I think about patients. And so that's reflected in the new book and the essays that are included there. There are some old ones, but there are also more recent ones about the work I've been doing based on these new influences.
Yeah, I was reading in this second book, and I'm seeing that it really explores some of the challenges that those of us in the field have in really finding the trauma-informed, constructive approaches to help those who have suffered from narcissistic abuse. And looking through, I see that it really looks at some specific themes. A few of them that were named were the attachment to internalized perpetrators.
Yes.
That phrase really jumped out at me, the self-alienation piece that you've been talking about, and then this internalized aggression. I wonder if you could, there's a lot there, but I wonder what jumps out at you first that you'd like to talk about.
Well, and I want to say that my ideas about internalized aggression probably aren't exactly in sync with the way Janina Fisher thinks about it. So these are not, I don't want to conflate myself too much with her influence, although it's been profound. But for me, what I have experienced with some of the most severely traumatized people that I work with, people whose developmental experience was really terribly informed by fear and neglect, a sense of being hated, a sense of abandonment, these very profound traumatic developmental experiences for people. And in some cases, these are people who then are left with as very intelligent adults a terribly chaotic internal world. And I see shame and fear as the main components of what is imprisoning about PTSD. That in one way or another, shame, fear, and the combination of the two is what keeps people imprisoned.
Mm.
And so that's reflected in the subtitle of the new book. And so when you experience a patient who's been severely traumatized, who lives in kind of chronic hyper arousal that only switches to hypo arousal and rarely ever finds a window of tolerance, sometimes with some of these patients, I have experienced the power of their rage and the kinds of attacks on me that are overwhelming, that are kind of shocking in the moment, that involve getting up and walking out of the consulting room and slamming the door, that involve hanging up the phone, that involve screaming very loudly in ways that upset my other suite mates. These are things that have happened in my consulting room with some of the people I've worked with. And, there was a time when I think I would have assumed that all of that had only to do with my empathic failure. This would have been early in my training. Certainly, the more people leaning more towards self psychology might have wanted to explore what was my empathic failure. But relational psychoanalysis encourages us to remain rooted in our own subjectivity and not completely yield to the other's subjectivity. So, in my experiments and in my explorations with these patients in those particular states, I've had to do a lot of thinking about what is therapeutic and what is constructive and what is healing. I don't think that empathy is the only therapeutic agent in these situations. I think our subjectivity, our feelings, our realness, and sometimes our own refusal to accept being attacked, sometimes our own anger. All of these can be therapeutic agents. There was a time after a big storm with one patient, I'm thinking as I say this, we started to calm back down and come back together. And in the midst of that conversation, I said, kind of casually, yeah, it makes me feel terrible when you treat me as though I don't care. It makes me feel bad. It's mean, is what I said. And that made a very meaningful impression on her because she didn't know that she was being mean. She didn't know that she was hurting me. And that I was able to tell her that in a non retaliatory way, in an effort to be constructive and without internally any sense of wanting to make her feel bad or wanting to punish her. That became a meaningful pivot. And I don't feel now as we continue to work, I don't feel now that she avoids her anger toward me or in general. We, in fact, spoke today and she said, I always thought that when people gave a diagnosis of bipolar or schizophrenic, that they were just blaming the patient and refusing to see the harm the environment or the caregivers had done. And I said, well, you used to tell me the same thing when I would suggest to you that you might be able to find ways of self regulating. You would say to me, oh, you're just trying to not have to be responsible for helping me by getting me to help myself. And I told her this, and she said, oh my. And she laughed, and she said, I wonder what I could say now to that me 5 years ago, or something like that. Something like, boy, I wonder where she was at 5 years ago, that me. So these ways in which we connect in a real way as real people are important, and that becomes very challenging for people who are trained to think that we have to assume that it's our empathic failure that has created the rupture. No, there's other factors that create ruptures. And what I've come to believe, and this I think is reflected in the new book, is that if we try to tell our patients that we do nothing but give, and that all we do is care and give, and that's all of who we are. We're asking them to be in a relationship with an impossible person who's theoretically perfect, and no
Yeah.
such human exists. And so if we assume all responsibility for every rupture, we're showing them a model that doesn't exist in any other relationship.
Right.
We're not giving them the chance to learn about rupture and repair. And any good repair of any real rupture restores mutual empathy. It doesn't just go one way. So these are all ideas that I'm exploring and trying to write about and think about. It really stems from the work I'm doing with some of the most severely traumatized people in my practice.
Oh, I so appreciate all that you just said. As a pretty new clinician, this has been a really important piece of my early training here and how it relates to NARM, because that is definitely a piece that is talked about, that we are in the room. This
Hmm.
is a relational model and we are in the room and we matter. We are humans. And I love this piece that you're threading in of that is actually really important for the client, for the patient, for them to have that experience of relating. It's so beautiful. And this work is so rich. I love what you're sharing here.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, just to be clear, many people are so terrified of the therapist that it takes a long time before this kind of mutuality can really develop. But I believe we have to have our eye on the possibility of that mutuality, even if we're very carefully not intruding and not impinging for a long time with our patients. At some point, the hope I always hold is that genuine mutuality can occur. And one of my mentors, Lou Aaron, always made clear that this mutuality is asymmetrical. Our focus is on the patient. We're not asking the patient to put
Right.
their focus on us. This is not 100% equal. We have a professional role and a responsibility. But ultimately, within those parameters, with those boundaries, our goal, I believe, is to create mutuality that feels safe and free, and that becomes a way for the patient to experience the possibility of safety in relationships.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about, I can't remember which chapter it is. Maybe it's chapter 5, where you talk about working with the dissociated aggression in
Right.
traumatized patients. That feels relevant here. Like this is an
Yes.
important piece.
Yes, it's relevant exactly in terms of who I was just talking about and what I'm thinking about more broadly. I do think that many of us who were trained psychoanalytically were trained in a model which possibly accidentally encouraged in us the idea of like this infallible empathy, this unceasing empathy that would never allow our own subjectivity to intrude or impinge. As I've said, the relational psychoanalytic model definitely wants to find space for the therapist as a human being, as a fully embodied human being, and as a human being containing multiple self states. So the work has become much more satisfying for me as I have more rewarding for me. I'm much less vulnerable to burnout,
Yeah.
and my patients feel, I think, a lot more held because of this. Now I'm going to talk about my understanding of parts. That's made a huge difference to be able to talk about with somebody the normal life self, is Janina Fisher's way of thinking about it. A part of the self that has never stopped putting one foot in front of the other and just has kept on going, has survived, has found a way to make it possible for there to be a future. It's a progressive part of the self. To understand how that part of the self gets swamped, overwhelmed, blended, because trauma parts have so much greater intensity.
Yeah.
And trauma parts that hold fear, that hold shame, that hold, frozenness, mistrust, how those parts can be so loud internally helping people to understand their normal life part of the self, the adult that has kept on going, and starting to help people honor and respect that as a real part of who they are. One of the patients I mentioned in the last chapter of the new book, it took several years for him not to continually assert again and again, no, the real me is bad. The me that is a CEO and an Ivy League graduate in a good marriage, and that me is not the real me. The real me is the shameful, ugly, stupid, incompetent, bad me, right? It took him probably 3 years to be able to say, the bad me is what feels like the real me, as opposed to the bad me is the real me. That came from my insistence on talking about different parts of him and that they were all him, right? So the embrace of our multiplicity has to include the embrace of the strong, healthy, going on with normal life part of the self.
Right.
And that's the part that people who have been traumatized often have the least faith in, or the least, they give it the least credit. So that's been an interesting way in which I've seen people start to shift and start to bridge that self alienation.
Yeah.
The thing that comes up most, I'll just say this is also part of what I am writing about in the book and several of the chapters, the clinical chapters especially. The thing that I've been now insisting on being able to educate my patients about is self-reflection and what that means. In psychoanalysis, it used to be you would learn that your patient will become more self-reflective, and that will show the benefits of psychoanalytic work. But how does the patient become more self-reflective, and in what ways? I have come to believe it's super important to be psychoeducational about self-reflection. So it's also referred to as mentalization. It's also referred to as mindfulness by some. It's basically, how do we explore what's going on inside? What are we feeling? What are the sensations, the emotions, the images, the thoughts? And what can we understand about what's inside? So my discovery in helping people self-reflect, which I think is interesting, is that they become self-reflective only to discover how defective they are and how disappointed in themselves they are. And so what I've had to watch for is asking people to be self-reflective who come up with self-contempt as the result of their self-reflection.
Right.
Then we have to start talking about self-contempt. Self-contempt is a dysregulated state. And if the goal of self-reflection is to help people be able to self-regulate, the biggest obstacle tends to be the part of them that is full of contempt for the other parts, for the vulnerable parts. So that's another major theme in the new book.
I'm curious how you guide that curiosity. You're saying we want to be open to what's showing up, and often the direction they go is toward the self-contempt. So I'm curious how you work with that as a clinician.
Right. Well, I'm pretty active in saying, okay, tell me more about that sensation, that image, that thought, that emotion. What is that part saying? If that part could speak right now to us, what would that part be saying? So there's that active way of asking for deeper self-reflection. But when the self-contempt voice starts to speak, I stay calm and I invite that voice. I say, oh, okay. So that part is saying you're stupid and you're weak and you're lazy and you're bad. Let's hear more from that part. So my effort is to remain interested and curious and model that. Let's be curious and interested in the self-contempt. Let's talk about it. What is it saying? What's it really talking about? And very often in taking that approach, the person who can speak out loud what the self-contempt part is saying will often recognize on their own that this is the voice of a perpetrator, that
Mm.
this is literally an internal version of the perpetrator's voice. And that recognition is meaningful. And so we can talk about, so that part of you is taking the side of the perpetrator, is taking the perpetrator's point of view. And then let's hear what the other part of you thinks, the vulnerable part. What does that part feel about that? What do you want to say to that part? So we try to engage that kind of internal dialogue among the parts. And that has been profoundly meaningful for many patients. There's an example I have in the book. One of the patients, a very successful professional athlete in a very nice, good marriage, nevertheless had been quite severely traumatized by an alcoholic father. And, this is from a very upper middle class background. And the mother was always trying to assuage the father, so that this incredibly talented young man grew up having to manage everything himself. He turned to marijuana and alcohol. Anyway, he was in his 30s, actually now choosing sobriety, working hard at that, but still just beating himself up so intensely, just for the slightest mistake he might make. And as we started really talking about that, and as he developed more and more interest in the idea of the parts of himself, he just spontaneously said in one session, so part of me is like my father's voice beating me up, and another part of me is just shutting down the way I always did when I was a kid. And it's happening now inside. That realization gave us so much to work with, so much possibility for healing and bringing the parts together in a way that they could accept each other, that they could work together, in the service
Yeah.
of the adult self.
Yeah, what you're sharing here, it really speaks to the importance from a clinician standpoint of not choosing a side, because when we do that, we talk about this in NARM, when we do that, we're actually like pitting one part of themselves, one voice, internal voice against the other, and that still it creates more of that internal conflict. So I really appreciate what you're sharing there. I remember another story that you share in the book about a client. I can't remember if it was a consult you were doing, but there was this line that really jumped out at me of where the clinician, I think it was you were consulting, and the clinician said to the client, "So yeah, I see you're wearing your mother's glasses.
Right.
Like you've put on your mother's point of view here." And that to me jumped out because of the agency piece, like reflecting back to the client, this is something that you're choosing for yourself. How is that,
Right.
how is that showing up? I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that phrase I thought was so powerful, such a
Mm-hmm.
wonderful choice. And it was somebody who was consulting to me, and it was about her patient. And I think that as a way of trying to capture again a part of the self that has assumed the point of view of the traumatizer. And that can be a very complex thing to try to understand, make sense of, and think about. Why would we internalize and perpetuate
Right.
what had traumatized us in the first place, right? And yet, there's many, many ways to think about that, talk about that. So I won't even try to go into all of the meanings that are possible, but it's useful to explore, as you say, not because you want to pick sides and say, okay, we're going to shut that part up. We're going to get rid
Mm-hmm.
of that part. We're only going to like these healthy, strong parts, and we're not going to listen anymore to these bad parts. I feel we have to try to explore what it means to preserve a part of the self that holds that point of view, what it means to this particular patient, what it means in that particular relationship. And this is another idea. I talk about it more in the book, although I did in the first book as well. I talk about the idea of the protector persecutor that Donald Kalshed, the Jungian analyst, has developed,
Mm.
and which Elizabeth Hall, who's a relational psychoanalyst, also refers to and talks about in her work, and which I find very meaningful. These persecuting parts within us, I think it's important to try to recognize that they are trying to serve a protective function.
Absolutely.
If once upon a time a narcissistic, abusive caregiver, parent was speaking to us in that voice, when we internalize the voice, it now becomes as persecuting as it is. The protective function that I understand in those kinds of parts has to do with trying to prevent this part of the self that wants to go on living, trying to prevent that part of the self from taking any risk, from exposing itself to any danger. If I risk trust, if I risk self assertion, if I risk being visible in the world, the persecuting protector part is saying, sit back down, be quiet, disappear, be invisible, and don't think for a minute that you'll ever be safe. Now, that kind of protection is obviously not helping, but it is helping in a way. It's trying to help.
Yeah.
So to understand these internalized aggressors, these internalized perpetrators as persecuting for the purpose of protection is a concept, again, that respects the fact that every part of us is trying in one way or another to keep on going.
Yeah.
Even suicidal parts, in a way, are saying there's a better way to get through this. It's hard to find the constructive, trying to survive aspects of those parts, but I think we have to learn not to be afraid of or turned off by those parts.
Oh, that's so aligned with a NARM viewpoint of every, you could say behavior, but every impulse that we have is an impulse to protect.
Right.
In that way. And so I just so appreciate you bringing that up, because I don't know, I'm thinking about my own personal process and how many years it took for me to get to a point where I realized that there were certain relationships where there were dynamics that were unhealthy in that way. And I think back, could I have noticed this 15 years ago?
Right.
And I'm realizing that I didn't have the structure of, support at the time for me to even realize, and how those voices, again, the tapes that I played, how they did such an important role at that time of protecting the connection.
Right.
We talk about that in NARM of how it protected my connection at that time that I really needed.
Yeah.
And how later, when I got to a point where I was able to have the support that I needed to change those dynamics and change some of those internal voices or those protective voices that were kind of inside of me, that then I was able. But as you're talking, that really is what comes up for me personally.
I appreciate that. When I chose to be a psychoanalyst, it was to train to be a psychoanalyst. It was about 15 years after I had psychoanalytic therapy at a point in my life in my 20s, in my late 20s, where I had become profoundly depressed and discouraged. So a friend recommended a low-cost service for psychoanalytic therapy. So these were candidates at a very orthodox Freudian kind of institute. I didn't know anything about any therapy at that time, so that's what I tried to do. And I remember very well the first session with one of those analytic candidates where I talked probably for 40 minutes about how bad I felt about myself, how bad I felt about myself. I was in so much pain. And the one and only thing that trainee said, you're really hard on yourself, aren't you? That's the one and only thing he said. It's taken me a long time to realize why that completely infuriated me. Because at the time, all I could hear from that was that everything was my own fault because I was so hard on myself.
Yeah.
And that if I weren't so hard on myself, I wouldn't feel so bad. So it sounded to me like he was telling me, this is all your fault, that you feel badly, right? I know that's not what he meant. I know that now. But at the time, I couldn't hear it. When I began 15 years later, my own training, I had that in mind. I knew that I would never sit with somebody and let them talk about their pain for 45 minutes and only say one thing at the end. I knew that I would try to be with them in a much more meaningful way. So before I ever had trauma training, even just in my psychoanalytic training, I preferred all the models that were more interactive and interpersonally oriented so that there would be, for me, a sense that this person knew that I was really trying to be with them. The benefit of the subsequent training in trauma theories has been to understand my own multiplicity in a deeper way, to understand that within us is always an energy trying to survive and trying to live. So we're not just trying to survive. I think we're trying to live. And everything going on inside of us is trying to make it possible for that to happen. By that, I mean to become who we are, to be able to trust our subjectivity and have faith in the goodness of the self, to be able to understand that human beings have a potential for dignity and creativity, and that that can be expressed in any number of ways. They don't have to be grandiose, and that's what's going on inside. There's always parts of us trying to survive so that we can live. And that has made a huge difference in the way that I work. Studying EMDR and really being asked to recognize that we within ourselves have healing capacities. We have healing energy that's innate.
Yeah.
I knew that, but studying EMDR really brought it home like, I don't have to think of myself as somebody who has to be endlessly kind and endlessly smart in order to help somebody. I can think of myself as somebody that can help people find within them that healing power. I can believe and have faith in that as part of who they are and direct my efforts towards helping them access that. It's a very different model from I'm going to be incredibly smart and incredibly kind, and that's going to do it.
Right.
It takes that's a lot of pressure.
Right. Yeah.
And what happens when you pressure yourself in that way, your patients don't respond, and then you're mad at them, and then you're burned out. And
right.
Trauma work has been so beneficial for me and for the people I work with.
Yeah. I remember reading, I think it was at the very beginning, but I remember reading a line, and again, another thing that jumped out at me, several passages jumped out at me, but you said that many sensitive people and intelligent people believe that they would never allow themselves to be put in a situation where they're deceived or taken advantage of. I know this is kind of switching directions,
yes.
But you kind of go on to say how unfortunate it is, that's not as uncommon as we would hope. And one thing that I really have appreciated about both your books, and I haven't yet finished this second one, I'm really taking my time with it because it's so rich, but I appreciate how depathologizing both of your books are, especially for any of us that have ever found ourselves in any kind of situation where we're being taken advantage of or deceived or put in these abusive relational dynamics, especially in relation with a narcissist, and then how that really can affect us. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Oh, I appreciate your referring to that because, that stems from the 13-year period in which I was completely absorbed in a relationship with a community and a leader or guru, which I came to view as a cult when I finally left. And of course, the word cult is a kind of a hot potato, and people dispute that it's a valid way to describe a community. And many of us have very sensationalized ideas about what cults are. Basically, what I understood was that I had determined that the guru was the ultimate expression of perfection in a human being, and therefore somebody that was infallible and somebody that I could depend on because of their infallibility, and that would lead to my complete healing and ability to grow and get unstuck. Well, there you have it. That, first of all, to your point, when people tell me, oh, I would never get into something like that, I just think, well, I often use this example. Well, Bernie Madoff's clients, the ones who were completely deceived and betrayed, were some of the brightest, most successful, most intelligent people in the country. When you say, I would never let myself be fooled, I think anybody can be deceived, anybody can be manipulated, and anybody can be controlled. it's something we wouldn't wish on anybody, but for many people, that has been their experience, and they need to be helped to recover from the profound shame they feel about having allowed themselves to be abused. Certainly, my experience of being in that abusive relationship with an abusive guru was to try to understand what is the psychology of somebody who allows themselves to be idealized completely and then uses the idealization to control and manipulate and exploit. You know, the cult literature and the ex-cult community and the small group of clinicians interested in that phenomenon at the time were talking about mind control, so that they were kind of thinking of it as a unidirectional phenomenon. Somebody who's evil has techniques that allow them to control you, right? I thought that was too simplistic. It didn't fully match my own experience. And so that's when I began to try to explore the psychology of the cult leader, which ultimately is what led to wanting to really try to talk about the relational system of the traumatizing narcissist, a system that they construct for their own purposes. The traumatizing narcissist had to develop, in order for them to survive their own trauma, they have developed a delusion of omnipotence. And in order for them to sustain that delusion of their own omnipotence, they have to have followers who support their delusion. And in order to have somebody say, yes, you are omnipotent, you basically have to disable that person's subjectivity. You have to disable their critical thinking. So you have to seduce and then manipulate such people to become, followers who support and help you sustain a delusion of omnipotence. People tell me, when cult survivors who look to my work tell me that it gets a little complicated, jargony, and hard to understand, I try to put it in as simple terms as possible. If I'm the traumatizing narcissist, I'll do anything it takes to sustain this delusion of myself as infallible and perfect and entitled. And one of the things I'll do is get you to join my delusion. And in order to get you to do that, I'm going to make you dependent on. So that dynamic is not just something you see with a cult leader and a follower. You see this in families, in vocational settings. You see this with therapists and patients. This is unfortunately well documented about therapists who are unethical and violating patients. You see it in marriages and sibling relationships. You see it in all the spheres of human life. And in that sense, it seemed important to me to make it clear that human beings are vulnerable to being exploited. They're vulnerable to being manipulated. That can happen to any of us. We need to understand these dynamics. We need to be able to see them as they play out. As therapists, we need to understand. Patients like myself, who had left the cult, were simply told that we were masochists. That would have been the old 1960s, 70s take on it. Well, this is your masochism. It goes so much further than that. And, I really wanted to be a part of the conversation about how to really understand those situations.
Yeah. To speak to that point, I remember in the book you referenced the work of Emmanuel, am I saying his name right? Ghent. And
yeah.
He talked about, and you referenced how he talks about the distinction between surrender and submission. And that really landed for me, because that helped me understand what you were just talking about. It's like, we are vulnerable in this way. I don't know if you want to talk about that distinction or if you want to leave it to readers to get in your book, but
no, I probably reference that work of Manny Ghent in just about everything I write. It landed for me in the most powerful and meaningful way, as did the work of the feminist psychoanalyst Jessica Benjamin. Her first book, The Bonds of Love, just profoundly opened up my idea of what it meant to have surrendered myself to someone in the belief that this would enlarge me. and only to eventually be able to see that, in fact, I had submitted to someone in a way that diminished me. And the difference between the idea of wanting to surrender to something larger that could allow for greater freedom or greater expansiveness of the self, and how easily somebody selling the idea of surrender could pervert that into a demand for submission, and how readily our desire for that kind of surrender could be manipulated into a demand for submission, you know. No, so I'm glad you bring it up. It's work that I think of as absolutely indispensable. His name is spelled Ghent, and the paper is basically easy to find because somebody has a PDF of that paper online. You look up Ghent, submission, surrender, and it comes right up. It's a wonderful paper.
I really appreciated that part of the book because it just, in a very short few words, it just explains kind of all that piece that you shared about that humans are vulnerable in this way when we want to expand ourselves, that we can be vulnerable to that. So I really appreciated that.
I appreciate your referencing it. It's so central to a lot of what I'm thinking about with all the traumatized people that I work with.
Yeah. Oh, this conversation has been, I feel like I could ask you so many questions for hours and hours, but I know that we're coming up on our time. And I wondered if there was anything else that you wanted to make sure that you drive home. I will say, in reading your books, two main things again that really jumped out at me were how you talk about the recognition of this self-alienation piece and how important that is. And then how important the development of self-compassion and self-reflective are, that it's just really imperative. And I really appreciate you bringing those. Those are both points that are very aligned with the NARM framework and the model. And so your work has just been really foundational in that way. But I did want to ask you if there was anything else that you wanted to share, and then also how folks can find you and find your work.
Thank you so much for the interest in my work and bringing up the points that I think matter the most to me. You know, I really appreciate that you were able to zero in on those themes. And if there's anything else, well, what I would say is that the difference between looking up to and respecting a teacher and idealizing a teacher, I think that's so powerful and so important. Recently, a college friend of mine, I was a theater major back in my youth in college at Northwestern, wonderful theater department there. And one of my friends has gone on to have a successful career as an actor and acting teacher. And he and a young actress recently developed a code of ethics for acting schools. And again, the possibility of a therapist or teacher or healer of any kind. And right now, there's a lot going on in the wellness, new age, yoga communities about teachers who are violating ethical norms. And this is going on in so many realms. And there it was again in the acting world.
Yeah.
You know, acting teachers taking advantage of students. They developed a code of ethics for what an acting student should expect in an acting school and from acting teachers. It's exactly what I would want to encourage people training to be therapists to understand, and people who are in therapy to understand that no human being has ever achieved perfection as a human being. And that anybody who places themselves above you in that way, as somebody who is perfected, realized, infallible, that's the person you need to leave. The teacher that you can respect and depend on is a teacher who understands their own fallibility, their own humanity, and who never tries to impress you with any sense of their superiority. It's so important. And the teachers that I have learned the most from have been the most humble, and, you know, their wisdom is incredibly impressive. Their expertise incredibly impressive, but not for a minute do you get the sense that they want to control you or manipulate you or exploit you or impress upon you that they in some way are superior. And I just think that that's something all of us in all the kinds of learning communities we exist in it's a way that we can help each other and be responsible to each other to bear those things in mind.
Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate this time with you. And that's a lovely note to leave on. And again, where can folks find you?
My website's probably the best way. It's just www.danielshawlcsw.com.
Great. Well, thank you again. The NARM community thanks you for your work and for spending this time with us together.
I'm so appreciative. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Are you interested in deepening your understanding of NARM? We are thrilled to offer the Inner Circle, NARM's online learning community. Each month, members receive direct mentorship from NARM creator Dr. Lawrence Heller, NARM training director Brad Kammer, and other NARM faculty through live webinars. The Inner Circle is also a hub for the international NARM community, where people working with complex trauma from around the world come together to connect, network, and develop trauma-informed projects to benefit our world. Visit narmtraining.com/innercircle to sign up and for more information. Our Transforming Trauma listeners can receive $100 off your annual membership when using the code TransformingTrauma15 at checkout. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.